Welcome to another edition of the Law and Gospel Devotional. My name is Erick Sorensen, and each time we gather with you to look at God's two words from all of the Scriptures, both His word of law, which tells us everything we ought to do and points out the many ways in which we do not do them, and most importantly, His word of gospel, which ultimately points us to all that God has done for us and our redemption on account of Jesus Christ our Lord alone. Well, again, as always, good to be here with you to dig through the Scriptures. It's going to be a busy week for me as I'm preparing to fly out to San Antonio for a weekend with the Executive Director of 1517, Scott Keith, as he's speaking at a church, and I'm meeting with some various pastors in the area, and so I'm looking forward to that. Might not be able to get a video out in time next week, so that's just little pre-warning for you, but I do have time to do this today, and today we're going to be looking at what I'm referring to as the Manifesto of Jesus. True enough, Jesus didn't explicitly say, "This is my manifesto," but nevertheless, when we look at the passage found in Luke chapter 4, verses 16 through 30, it basically reads something like what a manifesto would read like. It's a declaration of Jesus's intent. And so we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 4, verses 16 through 30, where Jesus sort of publicly comes out to his home synagogue and declares that he's the Messiah, chapter 4, verses 16 through 30. And we're going to see, on the one hand, what the contents of that manifesto of his is, and at the same time, we're going to discuss and see that the reception of Jesus's manifesto in his hometown is not very positive. In fact, he is utterly rejected. So why is that? Why do we see that happening? Well, we pick it up at verse 16. We're going to read through the passage and then we'll dive in and apply some things to our lives. So verse 16 says, "And he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day. And he stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, 'The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor.' And he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down, and the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him, and he began to say to them, 'Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing.'" Boom, mic drop. What an announcement. Very, very impressive. So what is the response to such announcement? Well, verse 22, initially it seems like there was some positive talk, but very quickly it descends into very negative talk. It says, "And all spoke well of him and marveled at the gracious words that were coming from his mouth." So they were impressed with his rhetorical skills. They were impressed with his declaration. But then you hear this, and they said, "Is not this Joseph's son?" And he said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Physician, heal yourself. What we have heard you did at Capernaum, do here in your hometown as well.'" That would be referring to all sorts of miraculous works that he had done in Capernaum. "And he said, 'Truly I say to you, no prophet is acceptable in his hometown. But in truth, I tell you, there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heavens were shut up 3 years and 6 months, and a great famine came over all the land. And Elijah was sent to none of them, but only to Zarephath in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. And there were many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed, but only Naaman the Syrian.' When they heard these things, all in the synagogue were filled with wrath, and they rose up and drove him out of the town and brought him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they could throw him down the cliff. But passing through their midst, he went away." All right, end of reading. Well, as you can tell, it goes from initial positive reception to great wrath and furious anger towards Jesus. So why is it that people reject Jesus back then and frankly still today? What can we glean from this passage to answer that question? Well, there's a few things. First of all, I think it's telling that they can't get past his humanity. I mean, they say, "Isn't this Joseph's son? We knew him as a kid. Who does he think he is?" And frankly, if you were living back then and you had seen somebody raised before your eyes suddenly declare to you when they turned 30 that they were in fact the long-awaited Messiah, it might be understandable for you to have a raised eyebrow too when he's claiming to have divine sonship, or at least alluding to that. And of course, this is a big hang-up for many that still study the life of Jesus today. You have scholars like Bart Ehrman or Richard Dawkins that have no problem acknowledging that Jesus actually lived, that Jesus was a human being. Very few, very, very, very few historians or scholars will try and make the case that Jesus wasn't a real person. There's just way too much evidence for it. For starters, Josephus and Tacitus, non-Christian ancient authors and historians, both tell us that Jesus lived. So it goes even above and beyond the gospel accounts. And so it's not a problem for people to affirm that he lived. It's not a problem for people to affirm that he was a human being. But where the problem comes is recognizing that he also is, in fact, divine. Indeed, this makes me think of the famous C.S. Lewis quote, who says, "A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said wouldn't be a great moral teacher. He'd either be a lunatic on a level with a man who says he's a poached egg, or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse." And so the first thing that they get hung up on about Jesus is the fact that he's a human being, and a human being cannot be divine. This is a big, 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 big no-no in Jewish theology. You cannot put a man in that place. And yet, the reality is Jesus is totally God and totally human, and that is a problem for them. Secondly, the reason they find themselves rejecting Jesus is because they don't like the truths that he has to tell them. They do not want to hear it. They want to put their hands over their ears. And so he says to them, "Truly, I say to you, no prophet is acceptable in his hometown." This is after he has acknowledged that they want him to do all sorts of miracles. And he says, "No, I'm not going to do it. And the reason why is because you won't accept me. Even if I was to cause someone to raise from the dead right before your eyes, you will still not accept my claims about myself. Indeed, we can look no further than the Gospels themselves, the rest of the Gospels, to see that Jesus does, in fact, raise people from the dead and cause blind men to see, etc., etc., etc. And still, the religious establishment rejects his claims of messiahship. And so they want Jesus to perform for them, but this is not how Jesus operates. In fact, the way he operates first is he exposes them via 2 Old Testament stories. And so they're not going to like what they hear. They want him to get out of their synagogue. Nevertheless, he's going to bring it up. And he brings it up by talking about the 2 prophets, Elijah and Elisha, 2 events that are recorded for us in the Old Testament. In 1, Elijah brings healing to a widow. In 2, Elijah brings healing to a leper named Naaman. Now, what do these people have in common? Well, Jesus says, "I tell you, there were many widows in Israel and there were many lepers, but the prophets were sent to none of them." The idea is because the people of God had rejected the truth of God, God then sent his prophets elsewhere to the dreaded Gentiles. And remember, in Israel at the time, Gentiles were referred to as being no more valuable than a rock on the ground. They were of the same value. They were seen as subhuman. And yet, Jesus points out that the prophets that they claimed to adore were rejected by the people, and so God sent them to those filthy, dirty, no good Gentiles. And so, obviously, they don't like hearing that because it's a total indictment of them. And so we read in verse 28, "When they heard these things, all in the synagogue were filled with wrath. And they rose up and drove him out of the town and brought him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they could throw him down the cliff." And yet, everything he said was true, but sometimes the truth hurts. And the human condition, when the truth hurts, is to suppress that truth in unrighteousness, according to Romans chapter 1, verse 18. And we all know this to be the case. When someone comes to us and confronts us about something that we don't want to have exposed, it's very natural to have the response of wrath, of anger, of defensiveness, because that truth that you've been suppressing in unrighteousness now is out in the open, and you'll do anything possible to push it back down out of sight because it's painful to have to hear a painful truth about something you're doing in your life or about your life. And that's precisely what Jesus does to them when he tells them the stories involving Elisha and Elijah. And yet, I'm not going to say that that's even the primary reason that they reject Jesus. I'm going to say something that is very counterintuitive to us, and that is the main reason Jesus' manifesto is rejected is because it's too gracious. And just as is common in many religious circles here today, it was very common back then to believe that too much grace is dangerous. In fact, after the Apostle Paul goes on to explain in Romans 1-5 the glorious grace of God revealed to us in the gospel, he knows that the first response to that is going to be the question, well, if you're saying it's all grace, Paul, are you saying that we should just sin and let grace abound? And Paul says, forbid that. Heavens, no, that's not my point. I'm not saying go and sin with abandon. But nevertheless, the impetus behind the question that they ask is based on a fear that grace will lead to licentiousness. And that always is a problem for the religious types. It's very, very troublesome because the idea is that once we let people know that they're forgiven of all their sins, they're just going to keep on racking up more and more of those sins. And really what's behind that is the age-old human desire to want to save ourselves. We want to believe that God is my co-pilot, that God and I are working together to make sure that I get saved. This is why every other religion in the world basically focuses on a set of rules for achieving a better, more heavenly state. It appeals to our sense of worth and meaning to say in some way or another, we at the very least helped God out in the process. It gives us the illusion of control, and there's nothing that we human sinners like more than at least the illusion of control if we can't actually have control. Some years ago, the great author Robert Farrar Capon and priest, Episcopal priest in this case, wrote, well, basically what he thought was the prayer of a person averse to the gospel, averse to this idea that it's grace from top to bottom that saves sinners. And so this is his prayer of the grace-averse person. Lord, please restore to us the comfort of merit and demerit. Show us that there is at least something we can do. Tell us that at the end of the day, there will at least be one redeeming card of our very own. Lord, if it is not too much to ask, send us to bed with a few sheds of self-respect upon which we can congratulate ourselves. But whatever you do, do not preach grace. Give us something to do, anything, but spare us the indignity of this indiscriminate acceptance. End quote. Robert Capon also said this, even to this day, grace remains hard to swallow. Religiosity and moralism go down easier than free forgiveness. He's not wrong, folks. It is the tendency of the human heart to want to justify oneself by what they do. And yet here comes Jesus into the synagogue declaring that his kingdom is going to be operated by this grace from, again, start to finish. And so Jesus says in verse 18, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me. Now, what has he anointed you for, Jesus? To start a kingdom here and now? To beat the Romans? To make us richer and happier and healthier? That's certainly what they hoped the Messiah was going to do, and it's what the majority of people thought the Messiah was going to do. But no, Jesus will say instead, I'm here, I was anointed to proclaim good news, the gospel. To who? The poor. Beggars. Now, think of the beggar that you might see on a street in Manhattan. Jesus uses that word to describe the poor. He says, I've come to herald good news to people that are beggarly, that are pathetic, that know they have nothing to contribute. He goes on. He's been anointed to bring liberty to the captives. He sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives, prisoners, criminals, freedom to lawbreakers. Who does he think he is? Does he want to tear down the very fiber of Western civilization? After all, we're a country based on laws. To you who are in bondage, though, Jesus proclaims freedom. He's not done. He says, in recovering of sight to the blind. Remember, the blind person was seen as probably cursed by God by many in Jesus' day. After all, he must have done something to deserve such a horrible lot in life. That was the logic of it. But Jesus says, no, I've actually come to give them sight. And I've also come to set at liberty those who are oppressed. Now, I love this statement. The word oppressed here is really doesn't capture the kind of strong word that is used here in Greek, because it literally means shattered. To those who have shattered their lives. They just made a complete mess of things, and everything's broken, and they have nowhere else to turn, nowhere else to look except up to Jesus for their salvation. To you, Jesus proclaims the year of the Lord's favor, or the year of the Lord's grace. Yes, Jesus is the one who comes to pick up the pieces of sinners' shattered lives and restore them, resurrect them, renew them. This is the way his kingdom's going to operate. It's going to be collecting a bunch of people that have messed up their lives because they're sinners, and he's going to redeem them. Yes, this is the way the kingdom operates, and that is absolutely the scandal of the gospel. Now you say, well, how can Jesus do that? Well, I'm going to tell you, the reason he can give you this manifesto is, of course, because he became all these things for you. While here, the Son of Man became poor that we might become rich. While here, the Son of Man became a prisoner that you might be set free. While here, the light of the world was for a time enveloped in darkness, and this Jesus, our Jesus on the cross, was indeed shattered for your sins, that you and I would be made whole again. And so he comes to you today and says, welcome to my kingdom, sinner. Welcome to my kingdom, those of you who have screwed up everything. You've messed up your whole life. My kingdom's for you. I want you. Welcome home. And that is the good news, and yet the scandalous good news at the same time, that will almost get Jesus killed and eventually does get him killed, all according to the foreknowledge and plan of God for the salvation of the world. Well, I hope that's an encouragement to you. Look forward to hopefully seeing you next week. If I don't, I've already told you why. And God's richest blessings on the rest of your week. Bye-bye.